Yo, what's good, guys? Happy October. I'm starting the month off with the review of a spooky album brought to us by electronic duo Shades. For those who have not heard of Shades, they are an electronic dark bass duo, and they've returned with their second studio album entitled From a Vein. The duo is comprised of members Alex Perez and Eprom. Perez is a producer from Belgium who primarily explores styles such as drum and bass and liquid funk. He's also the head of the UK-based drum and bass label 1985 Music. Eprom, on the other hand, is an American producer who's been a pioneer of hip-hop infused electronica, an influential player in terms of innovative and tasteful sound design. The producers initially came together to form Shades back in the mid-2010s and released their debut joint project in 2015. I would describe their sound as being a dark and grimy exploration of noise, specifically in cold and sinister soundscapes. Their style rewards the patient listener for sure, and is not for those who are expecting a ton of melody and quick, cheap thrills. Their sound is more like hues of gray and carries the energy of dubstep, and I use the term dubstep in the classical sense. Their music is an acquired taste where in the modern world of electronic music, if you know, you know. This album is a refining of the aforementioned style presented on their 2018 debut studio album entitled In Praise of Darkness. From a Vein is a total of 14 tracks sitting at about 50 minutes in runtime. Without further ado, I'll be going through the entire track list, highlighting my thoughts and favorite parts song by song, of course starting with the first, here entitled Infernal Regions. The intro is an eerie ambient track. We can hear stuttering samples drenched in reverb, easing the listener into a low, rumbling bass. The synth swells with reverb and its tone grows, leading the listener into the eerie melody. This melody feels like crows circling around in the sky, like a slow and sliding high-pitched synth ostinato. Once this fades out, we're left with the massive and hollow synth swells, which feel like they're being incinerated from the inside out. It's like a boiling sound. The synth melody appears one last time before the listener is carefully eased into the following song. Track 2, entitled Purification, featuring the Gas Lamp Killer. The intro ushers in two distinct melodies here. One is a sustained eerie synth melody that feels like a ghost creeping about on the mix, and a blippy synth arpeggio which then carries the listener into that beat. This blippy synth is reminiscent of analog synths heard in chiptune style production. The arpeggio then stops, forcing the listener to behold a thick and crunchy bass line. There's a liquid sliding synth melody that appears on the mix. It feels similar in tone to the bass. The drums feel like boom bap in their composition and sampling type, very organic in their sound and presentation. Soon the sustained melody reappears, this time in full force. The ghost has made its presence known to us. I like how the bass line mimics the melody and moves along with it in synchronicity. I especially love the spooky synth pad that hits after this section. It's ominous in flavor, much like a dissonant violin section. Soon a third melody enters. This one is a slower synth arpeggio that is quite creepy, with a softer quasi-plucked timbre to it. This leads up to the second blippy melody, which then builds into a bite-sized beat drop once more. We hear the first melody one more time, and the buzzing drums leave the listener with the blippy arpeggio again. It's not all the way there, mostly the wet reverb reflecting off of the walls of the mix, priming the listener for the following transition, into track 3, Deceitful Ways. The track picks up the trail and leads to a dark and deep sustained bass tone. It's distorted and the mix is drenched in reverb. It's like the listener is in a massive cavern. We're left in awe of the giant and dark space, and one can hear hints of something that's creeping around. The listener is not alone. A syncopated synth arpeggio enters the mix, and hi-hats and rides are not far behind after. The build-up hits the listener with distant sirens, and the arpeggios come in full force with the kick of the beat drop. The drums are a fusion of trap, with hints of breakbeat and jungle in flavor. The arpeggio melody sounds sick when juxtaposed with the menacing beat. The sound design is constantly shifting in timbres and color, eventually stabilizing once we reach the next build-up section. The second build-up raises the stakes as the mix becomes larger and more imposing. I'd say it's perfect because the second beat drop is massive. It's like you were running around in the cavern, terrified, and naturally, since it's dark, it's inevitable that you would run into something like a wall, and this drop is that wall. The kicks are gigantic and distorted, snares heavy, and the music seems to be reduced to the sounds of wind and digital shrieks and chirps. The drums are buzzing and being pushed to their absolute limits. And in a sucking rush of sound, the mix fades into silence, thrusting us into the following track, 4, entitled Immortals, featuring MCGQ. A large and syncopated detuned bass synth kicks us into this track. We can hear wispy hits of white noise and overheads swelling as hints of buzzing drums fade in and out of the mix. The mix grows steadily, only to drop the listener into a vocal sample. The drums then sneak back into the mix, hitting the listener with distorted, buzzing breakbeats, and then the beat drop, the kick, hits. It's huge, and the drop section follows a halftime groove. The snares are sharp, and synth shrieks hit in the spaces between the percussion perfectly. The second section of the drop switches up the groove, bringing in offbeat, lasery type synths, almost like steady blaster fire. I love the swelling sounds that hit when the mix grows silent. They're massive and lead the listener into the noisy outro. The drums steadily lead the listener into the light at the end of the tunnel as we march towards the next song. Words don't do the drums and sound design justice here, it's otherworldly work. Track 5, entitled Into Stone, is the following song. The intro is quiet and gradually ushers in what feels like hits of tiny metallic items striking a hard and smooth surface. Soon a hi-hat grounds the listener with a pulse, and a vocal sample hits. The sample has a ton of delay on it, and so the voice rings from ear to ear as the music slowly builds up. We also get a taste of the two main snares that we'll hear on the song, each lovely and metallic in their taste, but slightly different tones and pitches. Soon a grimy synth bass fades in, distorted and growling in nature. Distorted white noise swells and we're thrown into orbit into the drop. The drums during the drop section follow a loose dubstep groove with delay on the snares for a beautiful ringing effect. It's chef's kiss. Subtle hi-hats and heavy kicks offer the listener some sense of ground beneath them. It's almost like you're floating in the air. And beneath that, the bass synth takes center stage. Thick, distorted, and crunchy, it's got automation continuously changing its character and taste as the drop section offers plenty of space for the music to breathe. The second main section brings the bass back down to earth with its original gritty taste. Then we're thrust into another section where the bass begins to pulse with the beat and it feels even bigger than before. The music nearly slows to a stop and then we're introduced with a new drop section. The sound design becomes noisier and the drums shift in flavor. The delay also hits differently this time around, effectively creating a subtle change in tone for the song. I do love how fluid this track feels in its progression, and for the outro, a hollow sort of sound enters the mix, like a steady pulse of swelling tones of gray and wind. It's as if the voices of the damned are calling out for mercy as the music gradually fades out. We transition into track 6, entitled Dark Wing. The voices carry the listener into this track, and there's a big shift in a gradual ominous shift, that is, in tones, as if the voices have moved down several semitones. The mood of the song changes, and a vocal sample reminds the listener that we're still human. Then a squawking synth enters the mix, playing detuned tones. It's as if a crow were playfully teasing the listener here. The drop is like a sucker punch to the face, packed with an unbelievably heavy kick and a harsh and crisp snare. The bass is gritty, growling, and menacing as it sneaks around on the mix. I like the dog barks that are sprinkled into the mix for effect, and in the background we can hear unsettling synth swells and hits, creating an uneasy and largely atonal soundscape. The eventual addition of hi-hats and rides help make the track spicier, as if they've seasoned the mix to perfection. The second section of the drop features angrier and stuttered snares, harsher bass tones, and shredded synth swells and chirps. There's not much melody to speak of here, apart from the extremely distorted synth that swells, mainly playing about 4 or 5 notes in total. It's a beautifully subtle touch of melody. Eventually, a flute also joins in singing the tune. I love the ominous energy of this song. It's like we finally discovered the entity that's been lurking around in this cavern that we're exploring. And the outro hits the listener with phased and distorted saws, with ringing tones for maximum disorientation and tension. This tension continues into the following track, 7, entitled Against the Sun. This song gradually calms the album's energy down by reducing the mix down to pedal tones and subtle overhead hits. There's no real percussive elements to speak of, not significantly in terms of rhythm at least. It's primarily a lonely, ominous, ambient tune. It's like we're slowly driving down a dark and hot road on the desert, watching things fade away in the distant horizon. A synth melody joins the mix, moving in microtones, conjuring an extraterrestrial scenery with its unpredictable motion up and down on the mix. We can hear burning, distorted elements of noise and other sustained tones in the background, creating a rich and dark soundscape. The melody fades in and out of the mix, gradually growing larger and more menacing, eventually reaching higher pitches towards the end as well. This song is a lonely and delirious interlude for the album. It's quite beautiful as well. What follows is track 8, entitled As Wax by Seal. We slowly get back to the action with this song. A synth flute gradually fades in, playing a steady ostinato melody. It speeds up once hits of hi-hats and snares sneak into the mix, just barely out of the listener's focus. The vocal sample elevates the listener high up into the sky, only to let you plummet into what follows, the beat drop. The drop effectively brings everything into focus as the deep and heavy kicks and crispy trap-flavored snare beat the listener senseless. The bass tones are subtle in their appearance, sneaking in and out for hits here and there. They're syncopated in their motion as well. The bridge brings the flute back, blurring the listener's focus, as the drums at that point quietly tease the rhythms in the background. The second drop comes in full force, featuring a new rageful and spicy energy in the bass, as the tones are scalding and the kicks are more distorted. There's also hints of jungle-style drums here in certain sections, helping to spice things up. The background accompaniment is mainly atonal, full of swells and hints of noise, white noise, other samples. The flute then leads the listener into the quiet outro, as everything quickly fades to silence. Track 9 is entitled Exaltia. A thick bass pulse spooks the listener at the intro, as ringing sounds and samples lay a foggy and misty base for the soundscape. Soon, the pulsing synth melody is introduced, just playing 4 tones as it moves forward menacingly. A deep, distorted, and reversed vocal sample guides the listener into the drop, and the music of the drop feels like it's stumbling forward, with its kicks and snares anchoring the music's rhythm in place. In the background, we can hear pulsing, slimy bass synths sneaking around the mix. There's not much melody here, with different sounds playing in the background to further enrich that large sense of space. The bass groove changes in the second section of the drop, creating a more stable rhythm for the listener to follow. The tones are also burning and distorted. It's enough to make the listener sweat bullets at this point. The bridge after this hits you with a stuttering and stretched out array of different samples of noise. It's like a kaleidoscope of atonal sound sucking the soul out of you. The pulsing synth melody from before returns after this, bringing more winds with it and guiding the listener into the second drop. There's also sirens ringing in the background, creating more tension for the song. This drop that follows features more buzzing bass, synth chirps and scratches, evoking an industrial horror of Lovecraftian proportions with its massive space and harsh sound design. And then at the end, it's a quick fade out as we are rushed into the following track, number 10, entitled Sub Noctum. Crunchy hollow synth swells and a vocal sample bring us into a new groove. The words, "got 10 fingers but only use one," carry the listener forward with a hip-hop inspired approach to the drums. The vocal sample swells and distorts before throwing the listener into the drop. At that point, thick kicks and snares usher in the grimy buzzing bass melody. It feels villainous in tone, as if a mischievous entity were making its presence known to the listener. It's funky in its movement, probably one of my favorite grooves of the album. The steady hi-hats and occasional stuttering kicks are also a nice, subtle touch. And after the drop ends, we're hit with that familiar synth swell from before and vocal sample reappearing, and soon we're back to a new drop section. Here, the drums have some slight variation in rhythms, which I do like. The bass synth grows angrier, as if it were mocking the listener for not taking it seriously the first time around. It seems to get louder and plays higher pitches, higher notes, nearly overwhelming the mix as it moves up in pitch gradually. It's thick, distorted, and menacing. The outro loses the drums, leaving the listener with the ghostly sound of the bass line. It feels like a tail of reverb is brushing eerily against one's skin before the song eventually fades away. What follows is track 11, entitled Seek the Throat. Staccato synth bass hits kick the album into a new gear here, as a repeating chopped vocal sample throw the listener into the steady boom-bat style drum groove. The synth bass slides in between the big drums, creating more menacing energy. Rich rides fill the high shelf nicely, and soon we're at a build-up section. The listener is left with bit-crushed sounds and a ringing synth melody that pulses around the ghost of a drum groove. There's no drums there. There's a new bass melody introduced here, which carries us into the next section. We're thrust into a new drop with more of those slapping drums. The synths are slimier this time around, pulsing with the drums in a satisfying manner. Soon the listener is met with another build-up and subsequent drop, both similar to the original one as that original bass melody returns. The bass rhythms are slightly adjusted, but similar enough that it's almost indistinguishable from the first one. After this, the song quickly fades out, which leads into track 12, entitled Bleed. A synth melody that feels like the LFO knob has been turned all the way up so that the timbre is like very quick, it's like stuttering almost, greets the listener here. The melody is quite catchy and distinct. It's such an unmistakable sound. And soon, the massive bass synth hits the listener, rocking your brain around as subtle hi-hats and small snares gradually chug along forward. There's many vocal chops here as well. It's a gigantic verse section, this part right here, as the bass calms a bit before the eventual bass drop. The drop is nasty, featuring heavily distorted, boiling, and deep buzzing bass tones. The kicks are thick and the snares crispy. We can also hear more chopped vocal samples, short distorted sawtooth hits, almost like blippy arpeggios, but just very short, and steady hi-hats, of course. The bridge section that follows is similar to the first verse, bringing back the massive, crunchy bass and sweeping synth melody. That I can't get enough of that bass. It completely overwhelms the mix in the best way possible. The second drop section brings in more angry bass energy, blippy arpeggio hits, like similar to the ones before, but different notes this time, and more chopped vocals. I love the siren-like sounds that are introduced during the second section of the second drop, as they help increase the sense of urgency and fear in the tune. After this section ends, the deeper tones are dropped as the song swirls around and fades out gradually. It's a mesmerizing tune that I believe might be my favorite of the whole album. There's also a subtle sonic Easter egg at the end. There's the brief sampling of a melody coming from another EPROM tune entitled Hysteria. Hysteria was an awesome collaboration with fellow hybrid trap producer and frequent collaborator G. Jones. It's a massive and glitchy tune that I do recommend you give a try if you're into the weirder types of electronic music. It's a lot more catchier than most of Shade's tunes anyway. And that leads into track 13, entitled Arachne. This is a more subtle tune as the intro hits the listener with ringing hollow tones and a scratching synth melody. There's subtle melodic elements to it, but it's not what I'd call catchy. When the bass comes in, it's giant but not imposing. It lingers on the beat, following a steady, syncopated rhythm. I have to admit the groove does get very, very repetitive on this song. The drums are subtle, not quite the focus, as they do gradually chug the song forward. I enjoy the hip-hop influence, and there's slight breakbeat elements for transitions between rhythmic sections. The larger second groove section features different drum rhythms, and the wobbly bass does change accordingly, adding some much needed variation to the song. It is short lived, though, that variation, as we're eventually thrown back to the first and original crunchy groove of the song. And of course, not every song on an album can be a hit. This is definitely one of those like B-side tracks where you're not really missing much. And with that, we transition into the album closer, track 14, entitled Silent Image. The eerie intro hits the listener with ringing synths, like a quiet draft of wind rushing through a massive abandoned building. A rumbling bass enters the mix, malevolent and dark in its nature. The mix is drenched in reverb, indicating a gigantic space for the rumbling bass to toy with the listener. The bass is consistently automated, so the nature of its sound is constantly changing, chugging, boiling, growling, shrieking, and scalding in flavor throughout. Just imagine a massive, shape-shifting Lovecraftian creature in a gigantic, like abandoned hospital or something like that. I love how the music breathes towards the end, or maybe struggles to breathe. It's as if the bass were to linger as it angrily rejects the fact that the album you're listening to is about to come to an end. And eventually it does. Overall, this was a solid album. Shades has always impressed me in their ambient approach to bass music. Their production excels in many areas, including sample selection, groove and melodies, usage of automation, and their overall ability to stick to their firmly established aesthetic. This album, much like the rest of their music, is the type of sound you need to be patient with and fully experience from beginning to end. I had the pleasure of watching them perform live a few months ago, and I've got to say it was an out-of-body experience for multiple reasons. Bass tones and drums so massive that each hit, each hit, you can feel your soul slowly slipping out of the flesh coffin that we call the body. It's truly menacing and unsettling music that is, quite frankly, beautiful to experience. I believe it's work that is best suited for a live setting. And From a Vein is not a perfect album, but I've got to say, I've got to give the guys my respect for pulling off what I would say is an excellent follow up to their debut album, In Praise of Darkness. I can hear how meticulous and calculated each track was, as Shades carefully curate a cohesive body of work that truly embodies a certain and distinct mood. I'm looking forward to hearing more collaborations from this dynamic duo in the future, and I wish them the best of luck in their respective solo careers. They've got their plates full, they've got a lot going on. And I highly recommend you catch them live as well if you're into this kind of thing, should the opportunity ever present itself. And with all that being said, if you've sat here and you've listened to me talk about Shades and their second album, From a Vein, I truly have to give you all my thanks, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to do so. And if you've got music that you're really excited about, new music that's coming out, and you really want to share it with someone, you can send that my way. And if you work on music and you make music, and whatever kind of music it may be, and you really want to share that with somebody, or you maybe want some feedback, you can also send that my way. I'd be more than happy to provide you with my honest opinion and constructive criticism if you're looking for that as well. And once again, thank you for watching. I hope you're having a very wonderful day. Remember to stay hydrated, mask up. COVID cases are surprisingly still around. COVID is not gone. Take care of yourselves. Peace.